Good morning. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our session this morning. I'm Monica Ruiz, and I'll be your moderator for today. We're so thrilled to have you join in this topic, but before we begin, please allow me to go over a few housekeeping items. So if you need assistance during this session, please feel free to direct message me, and you can do that by clicking on the chat bubble up on your top right corner of your screen, and you can look up my name, Monica Ruiz, and send me a direct message there. Now let's take a look at the vertical toolbar on the right side of your screen. If you don't see it right away, then you might be on our event feed. You can exit out of that on the top right corner, and now you should see the different icons for the chat, the Q&A, polls, and the session resources. We ask you to please use the Q&A feature to ask all of your questions and vote on the questions you're more interested in hearing answered. We'll try to get it through as many as we can today, but your votes will definitely help us get that sorted. So if you need to take a break at any point, we do have a wellness room. You can just exit out of the session, and on the top left corner of your screen, you'll see the wellness room on your navigation bar. That is all for housekeeping. It is now my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Katie Pullman, whose passion lies in facilitating the implementation of the Interconnected Systems Framework. Katie brings experience from both community and school social work and now focuses on integrating school and mental health systems to support students' overall well-being. Welcome, Katie. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Monica, for that great introduction. I'm excited to be here and have many of you joining in this session and this topic today. Appreciate that introduction, and we're going to learn a little bit more about the Interconnected Systems Framework and how that supports community mental health agencies and community partners and school education systems coming together to collaborate and be more efficient and effective in supporting students' needs. I am with the Midwest PBIS Network. We are a hub of the Center on PBIS, which is a national training and technical assistance center funded out of the U.S. Department of Ed, Office of Special Education Programs. As a hub, we support multiple states in building capacity for positive behavior interventions and supports, which we'll talk a little bit more about as we get going. But one of our features or one of our focuses in this work and our team is how to integrate community mental health within school systems. Happy to be here to share with you. I'm going to publish a poll, hopefully, on stage now. I've seen some of you already responding, but it will help to know who is in the room with us today. So it looks like we have a little over 40 people. Would you select which best describes your role in supporting social, emotional, behavioral, or mental health? Our top vote right now is community mental health. I will tell you there is an other feature. You might want to be able to type in chat for that one. There was a limited number of spots, so some of my some of my areas were not able to be entered in. Awesome to have a few family members with us. Okay, so quite a few community mental health partners and some education partners. Flipping over to chat to see if there's anything on the other. I love a wraparound trainer. That is awesome. I know you can sometimes define that differently, but I appreciate that we are supporting families in that way. All right, it looks like we've had quite a few votes. I'm going to go ahead and, I believe, close that poll. And See if things go back. All right, it looks like I think my screen is resharing, so we'll keep going on knowing who we're talking to. So, a little bit of context in defining the need. Don't want to spend a lot of time on the data that shows that there's an increase in social, emotional, and behavioral needs in students, because I think that's what you all are experiencing every day in your role. But instead, this graphic is from the state of Washington and really emphasizing, we all thought in the middle of the pandemic was going to be when it was the toughest, there was the most need. And really, what we've found out is the needs have been increasing more as we've kind of moved out of that pandemic in the reconstruction phase. And so we're often finding ourselves asking, are kids lagging because of the pandemic? Are the skills worse? Are social, emotional, mental health needs worse? Or are kids and families and our society, are the needs just different now? But maybe our better question is, whatever the reasons are, why are we here? And is this our opportunity to revisit and think about the systems that we have in place and how we start redesigning those systems? If we don't think about that now, if we don't invest in the systems change now, we're going to inadvertently just stay in our our current ways of working. And we know, for whatever the reasons are, we know that the needs of families and students are and individuals in our society are higher for social, emotional, behavioral now. And so we have to start thinking about how have we traditionally been responding and how can we continue to improve that and be more effective in responding to those needs with less resources. How many of you have heard things said like, if we just had more social, emotional, behavioral experts, clinicians, school based clinicians, community based clinicians, if we just had more people, we'd be able to deliver more individualized support, which is true, but there really aren't more people to hire at the same time, right? Or if we just had a curriculum, a really solid curriculum, we'd be able to be meeting these needs. Or if we just trained staff in trauma informed practices, or if we strengthen families and community our partnerships and within our community providers, those things are great, but they aren't going to, if we don't redesign the system in which those sample responses are happening within, it's not going to be enough. We're going to revisit these sample responses in a little bit as we talk about the interconnected systems framework. So it's not enough just to hire more people or buy a curriculum or do some training if we don't redesign and put it into a framework that's going to really support how we are responding. So a little bit more in that context and where we've been is for over the last 20, 25 years, the Center on PBIS has been funded from the U.S. Department of Ed, supporting schools across our country and we don't support internationally, but implementing internationally a framework that positive behavior interventions and support, which is really helping schools think about what interventions are they going to do for all, some, and few, using that tiered logic, but also using a framework of data systems and practices that really are centered within equitable practices and equitable outcomes. And so many, many years of schools and increasing like that implementation and using that framework, using that tiered logic framework from our public health first originated in the public health setting. What can we do for all to prevent, to support and build those competencies and resiliency that is going to prevent the need of higher levels of intervention. However, we do know that some will still need more. And so how do we build efficient and effective targeted interventions for groups of students that are highly effective in responding to the needs that are coming up in our school-wide data? And so building in tier two, a higher dose of what's already happening at tier one in efficient ways for groups of students so that we can limit that need to individualize and provide those highly intensive interventions, like someone mentioned in chat, wraparounds, right? We are going to need that, but we don't have the resources to respond to all behaviors and all needs with that intensive of an intervention. So if we use our tiered framework, we can limit the number of students and families needing that level of support. So schools have been using this tiered logic, but again, putting the data systems and practices in place for the continuum of behavioral intervention for many, many years. And they're building out continuum of supports that not only have, this is just a sample of what a continuum of support in a school might look like, but that they are putting the systems, how do students move through those interventions? How do we identify students for those interventions? And, and start monitoring the progress of those interventions so we can make decisions on when they might fade back down to a lower level of support or move up to a higher level intervention and receive that need, but very systematized, using our data and having a continuum for that support. Through that implementation, schools, and there's been lots and lots of evidence of all the outcomes that's improved student outcomes, including that social emotional behavioral competency, improving academic outcomes, reducing bullying, decreasing the rates of students using substances. That exclusionary discipline has definitely is one of the leading outcomes when schools implement PBIS. Reducing the number of office referrals and suspensions, restraint and seclusion. And outcomes have also showed improved teacher outcomes, teacher perception of their own efficacy, the organizational climate and health, teacher retention. All of those things have been proven outcomes when we're implementing PBIS well. But even with all of that, schools still struggle to implement, especially those higher level tiered interventions effectively with the staff that they have. And so there's still this need to do more in schools. And how do we support schools to do that? The other context setting is over the years, we have seen more school-based mental health, where community agencies are providing mental health services in school environments, which is highly effective as well, right? Expanding the number of interventions and supports students can receive while they're at school. But we do this in that co-location model where school PBIS is on one side and school mental health is on another. It might look like clinicians having offices in buildings or coming into buildings a couple days a week and having space to deliver those interventions, but we're not necessarily making decisions together. So co-location, we'll dive into more of that as we keep going. So school mental health and that practice of bringing mental health interventions into schools has been also shown to give lots and lots of great outcomes, especially that point of that youth are 6 times more likely to complete mental health treatment when they're offered in schools and more access to those mental health interventions. So both of these pieces of how we've been working are amazing and have lots and lots of strengths and supports. And what we're still seeing is this need for more. And so we want to revisit that idea of how do we go back to redesigning that system. I'm going to give us back to another poll question and kind of see where are things at and how would you describe your system? Some are already responding, but I'll show this poll on stage as well. So how would you describe your current availability of mental health support services in your community? So mental, guys are, well, changing every second here. Kind of in that middle range. Mental health supports provided within schools, but somewhat in that co-located model right now is kind of the highest response. Great. Well, I'm watching these come in. I'm going to flip over to our Q&A. Looks like we're doing okay there. Okay, so this is helpful. So most of us are seeing somewhere in this co-location model of mental health services being offered in schools, but not necessarily integrated together, where we're making decisions and monitoring those at this within one system. Right, great. Looks like I'm back to sharing my screen. We're going to keep moving us forward then. So, where do we want to head? What is our desired future? So, I love this what if land. What if, in my utopia world, what if, and this is actually happening in places, but what if school employed and community employed staff used school and community data to assess the needs of young people in their school community, and together through an integrated team they selected evidence-based practices that match those needs, that match the needs coming up in their data. Meaning we move away from this co-located model to a fully integrated system where schools and community mental health agencies are working together within one system to make decisions about the interventions that are successful and needed for our students and how we're going to monitor those. So we call that the interconnected systems framework, and that's where we are wanting to help more of our systems be able to move, draw on the strengths of both of those systems. But we also need to think about that within a framework. So if we do things without a framework, we kind of get all these pieces of what's happening, but we don't have anything that's really functioning. So I love this graphic of we can have all the pieces of a bike, but if they're not put together, that bike isn't really going to help us get anywhere or do anything. So the lots and lots of research would say a multi-tiered system of support, or an MTSS framework, is a framework that's grounded in that public health model for prevention, and consists of providing a continuum of evidence-based practices using data. But it's also what we're going to keep hearing is data systems and practices. We need the systems like the teaming structure. We need data decision rules for how students are getting into interventions and how we're going to monitor those interventions, and how students will move through those. We need coaching as a system. We need coaching to both our community mental health providers and community partners, as well as our school based teams. And we need practices. We need those effective interventions that are matched to our need. So we need data systems and practices really all working together. And that's what a multi-tiered system of support. And we'll look at those critical elements of that in just a little bit. So if we're using our MTSS logic, we're going to redesign the system. So remember those sample responses we saw earlier, we're enhancing those. What would that look like if we use that MTSS logic? So not just the need to hire more social emotional experts, but instead, how do we more effectively utilize the social emotional behavioral experts that we have and have them support teams across the continuum? Our social emotional behavioral experts supporting teams at tier one to help enhance and deliver interventions to all students, all families, all staff, that are going to help us prevent that need at a higher level. So, how do we start integrating and using those experts as leaders in our building that are helping us make those key decisions? Um, what about not just selecting an evidence based social emotional curriculum, but instead let's have formal processes for how we're selecting and prioritizing the interventions that we are delivering. Um, we get caught in this new shiny thing way of work often, and instead what if were really intentional and really just focused on doing a few things but do them really really well, rather than doing all the things and not having any gauge on if we're doing those well or not. And so we want to shift and have these processes for Here's what we're going to implement. These are our few evidence based practices that we want to really focus on doing well, rather than all the things at one time. That we train, but instead of just training staff, are we utilizing those that expertise, that trauma informed expertise on our teams? Thinking about how we are making those decisions, and all of our practices trauma informed, and do we have an understanding of why the practices we're implementing are trauma informed, and are we building that capacity within our staff rather than a one time training on being trauma informed. And our strengthening our partnerships with our families and our community partners, really about expanding our teaming process, including and making decisions together, looking at data together, and working together. So not just a sample one, like here's the magic piece that's going to change our system. It's really about redesigning our whole system. So let's keep going into, so if that's our desired future, what is an interconnected systems framework or an ISF, and how do we achieve it? So, a common definition we use for an interconnected systems framework is it's a structure and a process. Not a thing, it's a structure and a process or a framework for education and mental health systems to interact in the most effective and efficient ways. So, really important. It's not a new curriculum. It's a framework. It's a process. We have to have key stakeholders that have authority to make decisions and reallocate how work is happening. We need to have them engaged in that process. And we can work towards an ISF or an interconnected system at any real level. The higher up we go, the more impact we can have. There's lots of systems that are barriers, especially at that school level of implementation. So it's not that you can't implement an interconnected system at a school level, but there's likely to be barriers that aren't going to be able to be removed, such as mental health partners being on school based teams. We likely a clinician themselves is not going to be able to change their availability to be on those school based teams if we don't have leadership at a district level engaged, that in their and the community mental health directors and their supervisors engaged in making changes, um, to the amount of time that they need for direct bill and those sorts of things. So we can implement and integrate systems at all levels. However, the higher up we can go, the more impact we can have on that system's change. And we want to be able to create a symmetry, a process as high up as possible. So if we can have some state leadership doing this work, it can help funnel down and support more effective implementation lower. So what does it look like? What's an integrated system of support, or an connected system framework? What does that look like? It looks like teams of school and community and family representation and youth representation, making decisions together to define a single continuum of interventions, not a community mental health provides these interventions in our building and our school provides these, but they're separate and we hand off to community mental health. But instead, we have one single continuum and ways that students access those. We'll look at some examples of that. We monitor student outcomes together, so that we both have, that both systems and families have input on if the student is making outcomes and achieving and being successful in the ways that we all define together. That we build staff's competence and confidence to support social, emotional, behavioral, and mental health. It has to be everybody's job. It can't just be our social, emotional, behavioral experts. So there's four key messages of the interconnected systems framework that's been around since the kind of the initiation of this framework about 15 years ago or so. And we're going to kind of dive into each of these to get a better feel for what would it look like operating in a building. So the first key message is a single system of delivery, which looks like teams selecting and implementing and monitoring those continuum of interventions. So we want to think about integrated teaming structures, not mental health having their own set of teams or community partners having their own set of teams and schools having theirs, but instead teams that work together to make decisions about the same population that we're serving, our students and families and our members of our community, right? And so we need to work to make those decisions together. We're trying to achieve the same goals. So this work is most effective when we start that at a district community leadership level. Or again, in that symmetry of process, we could do this at a state or regional level as well. But as a district community leadership team, if you look at some of the samples there, you're seeing it's representing both education and community systems that are those key stakeholders that have authority to make decisions about how resources are being allocated and changes. So district community leadership team is really helpful in changing those systems over time. In a school, there's a lot happening on this slide, and I recognize that. What I want us to take away from this is a way that we've seen schools organize teams or conversations for supporting a multi-tiered system of behavior across all three tiers. And the big takeaway would be look at the membership here, that we want our community mental health partners and family and student voice being operational in those teams, being members on those teams. And we're together, we're making decisions about what interventions and what we're doing at tier one for prevention. What are some of the targeted interventions we're delivering? And then how do we design individualized supports together with voice from all of those partners? Another component you saw there was the data. What data are we using? And we want to start expanding the data that we're using. So we're identifying and using community data, as well as expanding the data sources in schools that have traditionally been more externalized behavior data sources, office discipline referrals, suspension data, maybe some attendance data. But what if we started looking at things like time out of class when students are visiting the school nurse or counselor, or just frequent visits to the restroom? That might be those students that are have more internalizing types of behavior for avoiding and being out of the class. So if we expand the data we're looking at, how do we end up with a single continuum of interventions? So this is an example from a site that I've done some work with over the time. They're an alternative site, education site. They had multiple community partners providing interventions in their buildings, and they had school-based clinicians providing interventions. When we started this work and we started inventories of what they had available to students, they were realizing they had a lot of things that weren't truly interventions, and they also didn't have them organized. And here's some low level tier two interventions where we could start students off to hopefully prevent that higher individualized needs. They were really jumping from what did they do for all students to individualized tier three supports. So by sorting out what were each partner able to provide in interventions, they organized this continuum and data decision rules for how students would move through those interventions. So more students are accessing interventions. There's less duplication of intervention happening, and the interventions are more effective because they together. This represents both school and community and the interventions that they are able to provide. There's a more robust continuum of intervention based on a higher needs setting, but gives you the idea of what we want to be looking for. When we think about that single request for assistance process, traditionally it's been each service provider kind of having their own referral process. If you, a teacher or a family might fill out a referral for the school-based counselor or a school-based social worker, or they might but then there's a separate referral form for the community mental health providers that come in. And then, that there's multiple avenues, which often gets into that duplication of services happening. Also, when we call it a referral, we're really transferring the responsibility to one individual, a school-based or a community-based clinician, rather than it being all of our responsibility to support that student and the needs that are there. So within an integrated system, we want to think about one request for assistance process that one coordinator is able to review and help make decisions and match students to those interventions we just saw in that continuum, or bring it to a team where together we make decisions and about what intervention and what will look like, what will the outcomes or success look like as we define that. So I think this is a huge piece within an interconnected system, is that we transition from a referral process to a request for a decision making or a request for assistance process. So move from that handoff. This is now I'm making a referral, which denotes it's more of now it's the social workers responsibility or the community partners responsibility to together let's make a decision about the intervention and how we're going to deliver that intervention and monitor that intervention together. So we move to that shared decision making. The other piece within that single, the final piece within that single system of delivery is that I mentioned having data decision rules. How do we know when a student will match to the interventions that we had in that continuum? And so together as those integrated teams, we set what are the data sources that we have and we can collect, and what's going to be the threshold that would identify when a student might need trauma-focused CBT or might benefit from an anger management group that is delivered. So together we set some data decision rules, which allows us to be more efficient and effective and better match students to the appropriate level of intervention. The second key message is access is not enough, and this is a huge one. We love to state things in the positive in PBIS world, and this is one that we've just always struggled to do that with, because what we really want to think about is that all interventions need to have data that are monitoring student outcomes, no matter who they're delivered by. How we're together we're defining what will success look like, and we need data to know that. So this is that same data decision rule that we just saw for the entry in or the identification in, but every intervention that we have in our continuum, what will be the data that we can monitor while they're on the intervention, and what will determine success? DPR stands for Daily Progress Report. I'm going to show you that on the next slide. It is a way for students to receive feedback throughout their day on skills that they're learning or being taught in those interventions. It allows the feedback and instruction to happen on a regular basis by all staff in our buildings and schools, and also gives us data on how are those skills being generalized into the setting of the classroom or throughout the building. So you see in the exit rules that they're receiving 80% of the points on their daily progress report card. That tells us skills are being generalized. But we're also wanting to see that they're increasing data points that might have got them into that intervention. So they're able to rate that they're feeling good, and I'll show you where that is. Or some schools have emotional check-in systems, data systems that they use daily that could play into that. And that they're meeting the individualized goal. So if they got into this intervention because of unexcused absences, then we'd want to see unexcused absences improving in order to say that intervention happened. So we want to together as teams say what is going to show that success is happening. And for every intervention, no matter if it's delivered from the school or a community partner, we define that together and we work together to say here's systems and how we can build this together that will support that that we're able to monitor those outcomes. So here's an example of a daily progress report card. The be safe, be respectful, be responsible are typical examples of a school of school-wide expectations at that tier 1 level, meaning all students are being taught what those 3 expectations look like in more specificity in for different locations. So the idea here is aligning. So this is probably an intervention that might be delivered by a community mental health partner in a building, and more of like a trauma informed CBT type of intervention. And what we can layer the skills that are happening in that group or in that individualized intervention. Students are being taught to recognize triggers. How's that aligned to being safe? Um, they identify and scale emotions. They're able to use a coping strategy throughout their day. They're in this example, it might be a student needing to do some self rating, but we want to have a conversation with that adult, that teacher in that room to say, how's that? Talk to me about when you were able to recognize your triggers. What went well for you? Tell me a little bit about that. Right? If they can have that conversation, it helps us with that instruction throughout the day rather than a one time a week intervention that is like unlikely to change those behaviors. How I felt. Oftentimes, we see schools use language that they're using at tier 1 to scale feelings. If that's a feelings thermometer or more of a curriculum that they're using, then they can scale that on the bottom and we can track the final, or sorry, not quite the final, almost the final. The third key message is mental health is for all. And the big idea here is that we want to think about mental health is for all, meaning it's for all staff, all families, and all students. And so a big shift has happened in our workforce to say staff self-care is really important, and staff supports are really important. So, how are we using that tiered logic to think about the supports that we're providing for our staff as well? And so, this is just an example of what a continuum of supports for staff might look like. The other piece of mental health is for all is that supporting mental health and social emotional behavioral has to be every job. It cannot just be the clinicians in our buildings. There's not going to ever be enough clinicians to hire or put in our buildings to respond one student at a time. So we're moving away from this idea that clinicians have some magic wand in their office or in their bag, and that we have to that all of us can help support. Doesn't mean that they're delivering therapy, but how do we help use that, build staff's comfort with uh, using those little micro instructional moments and supporting students in the classroom. So we're really moving from them being the only experts in our building to they're the leaders in our building that are supporting staff to build their confidence and their competence to support students in their classrooms. So we really want to lean into those clinicians as our experts in our building, but how are they building capacity of staff? That looks like them being on teams. That looks like them maybe providing some of the professional development and support, some of that coaching in classrooms, helping develop systems that are feasible alongside the teachers on how can we monitor those skills, like that daily progress report card. The other ways is we're starting to push things down to that tier 1. What can we do for all students in that prevention mode? So we've seen a lot of schools transition and continue to expand. This is an example of this is a classroom matrix. Schools often have a school-wide matrix as well. On the left-hand side are the school-wide expectations, and then we define those for different areas of the classroom or the building and different routines. But a common routine that schools have really been saying, here's something we can teach to all kids is a when I feel upset routine. When I feel anxious, when I feel angry, here's the steps I'm going to use. This gives all staff common language to use. This is preventative in teaching. If we have this matrix, we're teaching this to students, we're using that language. So we're preventatively teaching. We use it in responding when students are feeling upset. And the other image here, it comes from second step or social emotional learning curriculum. So the idea is, how do we align with what we're already teaching students, make sure that language aligns into our school-wide expectations as well. Other ways that we're helping, want to help push that down and help build that staff confidence and competence is supporting them through helping them not just understand um, student escalation and brain development, right? That those phases of regulated or dysregulated brain, but what can they do in those different states? And so this is a graphic from a brief from our Center on PBIS on aligning those classroom practices within that escalation cycle. So the things in green, the teacher practices, those are common classroom practices. There's lots of resources for those on our Midwest PBIS site or on our Center for PBIS site. But those are common classroom practices that we want to not just teach student or staff to recognize that brain and when it's dysregulated, but what can I do? And how do I utilize those strategies? How do I put those practices in place that support all students and preventing and keeping the majority of students in that calm state. And then when they start to escalate, what's my toolbox? What's my continuum of strategies to respond? And when might I use those? Those are common strategies for students, for teachers to know and use, but do they recognize when, how to use those strategies as that what works for different students when they're at different levels of escalation, and do they recognize the function of behavior behind those? So those are things that we want to utilize our social emotional behavioral clinicians to help build understanding and capacity, but we have to again select and be like, here's specifically what we're going to do, rather than here's a million different strategies you could pull from. When we see that oftentimes when we do trauma informed training, here's all these strategies, but we're not systematizing, we're not giving them, here's the small toolbox, here's what it's going to look like in our building, here's how we can monitor fidelity. Then the last key message is multi-tiered system of support is essential to install school mental health. Think back to that the graphic with the bike. This is saying we need to have a framework in which we are aligning and integrating our school-based mental health services and our social emotional behavioral supports from delivered from the school. So ISF helps us enhance those MTSS core features. Multi-tiered system of support, or MTSS, is a framework that we hear a lot about in education, but not always clearly defined. And so what you're seeing in this gray box are the 6 core features that we pull from to define what are those core features of a multi-tiered system of support. We need teams. We need ways that we're monitoring. Are we implementing what we say we're implementing the way it was designed? So number 2 is evaluation of fidelity of implementation. We need to use that tiered logic to define a continuum of evidence-based practices that are specific to our local context and need. Number 4 is we use data to drive, to make decisions and to progress monitor all interventions. that we have comprehensive ways for screening or identifying students early for interventions and support. And the last one is a system piece of professional development, ongoing professional development and coaching. So remember I said a PBIS is a framework of data systems and practices. So when we enhance those 6 core features within an interconnected system, we expand that team membership. Community and family are involved in our teams. We provide support and coaching to both community and school, collaborative planning and training together to design those systems has to happen. So systems support the adults, teams, professional development, 2 big system pieces that support those adults. Data is the second circle here. Within that data, all of our interventions, no matter who's delivering, school or community, have a way to monitor fidelity and outcomes. And we have ways for identifying students with both internalizing and externalizing. And the third circle is the practices. Practices support students. Systems support adults. Practices support the students and families. And what are and so within an interconnected system, we have a continuum that is bringing those 2 sides, that education and community mental health, together to define that one comprehensive, robust continuum of support that's delivered together. So I've been talking for a while, and now it's time to check in. And here's some key words or phrases that you might use to describe an ISF. This is also going to be my opportunity to check in on questions that are coming up. What are things that you're hearing and phrases that you would use to go back and describe an ISF, or things that would be powerful and improvements in your system, since most of us were in that system of kind of a siloed approach? What did you hear differently here? One door approach, integration and decisions include families. Awesome. Lauren saying strategies can be overwhelming, right? Yes, let's limit and be selective, find things that are match our highest needs. All right. I'm going to flip to our Q&A. All right, so I'm seeing a question of, is there data that shows more families are withdrawing their child because district is not meeting their behavioral or mental health needs? Melissa, I am um, not sure if I know data. I would love if others on this call or that, if you have data to share, I think that'd be great. I will say I think that there is definitely the data showing that students are leaving some of our public schools, and I think there's multiple reasons for that. I'm not sure I can cite the exact references on that, but I know I've definitely, been hearing more and more about students leaving public schools, and possibly some of it's not meeting behavior health or mental health needs. I think some of it is also, sometimes the misunderstanding of what are we teaching when we're teaching social emotional learning and those sorts of things as well. So I think it kind of is maybe on both sides of a continuum with that. I see a question about, oh, moved up too much. Students experiencing autism fitting into this model. So definitely that a public health framework and the and PBIS, and then how do we integrate with an interconnected system? We are talking about all students, and so actually there's quite a bit out there on that with those outcomes for PBIS implementation, saying that when we implement with fidelity, we see outcomes for all in proportionate ways. So students with IEPs responding and students with disabilities responding with the same proportion as students without without IEPs. And so I would say students with autism definitely fit. We want to design that continuum to match or to support all students in an effective way. And we want to disaggregate our data and monitor that as well. I also know we have many other alternative education settings that utilize a PBIS framework or that interconnected systems framework to support students. And then I'm seeing a question about what data can CMHC effectively share to support PBIS ISF initiatives. What data from our clinics would be beneficial for us to share with school PBIS teams? So I think that there's lots of data that we can share, and kind of depends on maybe what phase of implementation we might be in. And are we working at at a district level or a school level? But I definitely think what are the what crisis data, if we support students and families that are in crisis, like life threat assessment crisis, that's data that we often see being shared, that increase, or student hospitalizations, which districts also usually have. What data are we seeing, maybe diagnosis wise or referral wise? What are the requests? What are the referrals coming in? What are the biggest needs that you're seeing? I think those are some of the big data pieces. When we get into that those types of data are what we want to use to say, how do we define that continuum? What's the biggest need in our area? When we see referrals coming from this school, the largest referral is basis is for anxiety. That might help us say, what are the interventions that we might need to be delivering, or how do we help inform and teach more at tier one around uh, that behavior or those that need there. And then as we start to implement and monitor those interventions together, then it's about how do we share individual student response. That's how do we plan those together, where we're having youth and family voice at the table to design that intervention. And here's the data we use to monitor that, which might be more of an assessment or rating scale type things that we're monitoring that from a community, from the mental health lens. But we can also watch school data like attendance and monitor that together. Um, so we're sharing that data and we're seeing the outcomes together within that. So hopefully I'm helping answer some of that question. So I'm seeing a question about still don't know how to get schools on board with everything else on their plates. How do you help that one teacher that's just not getting on board? And Melinda, remember that piece about the higher up we can go in that symmetry process, the the easier, the better, right? And so if we can work from a district level, you're right, there's a lot on everybody's plate. Schools, but also um, all all of us, right? No matter what our role in this society is, there's a lot on everybody's plate, and so I think it really does have to start with sorting out what are we doing, what are the things that are working that are getting us outcomes, what are the things that are not getting us outcomes, what's our data tell us we should be prioritizing, so we can start to take things off of those plates rather than keep piling on. Because you are exactly right. It's going to be really, really hard to get everybody engaged. So, in my mind, that's where starting at that district level really can help us to sort down and say, here's our vision, here's what our focus is, here's what we're going to prioritize doing really well, and we're maybe going to put this off to the side for now or not focus on these things because we're gonna these are our top priorities based on our data. Because getting one teacher on board is going to be tricky if we don't have that systems change happening. So that would my general response there. I'm gonna keep us moving. I have a few more next steps pieces. I appreciate those questions. Those are helpful. All right, let's keep back. All right. So as far as, what can we do? What are some resources and some next steps if we're looking to continue to share? The Center on PBIS, pbis.org, is the National Center's webpage and under the topics, there's mental health and social emotional behavioral well-being page. On that page is the monograph volume 2, which is written as an implementation guide. And it's posted by chapter from exploration and understanding to installing at the district level and then the school level. Both chapter 4 and 5 also have installation guides, which I'll show you in just a second, those screenshots um, that have some additional resources. So this is super helpful, but also lengthy, but able to hopefully break that down a little bit. If you scroll down on that same web page, you get to some resources that are curated into getting started, state or district installation, school installation, and then some other topics. So this is maybe a little less overwhelming when we're just starting to explore and get into some understanding. If today's conversation, was insightful and something you might want to share with some others in a short way, on our Midwest PBIS page under Getting Started with ISF, we have some videos to introduce the ISF to education and community leaders as well as families. There's also a document that defines the acronyms, common acronyms and terms within an interconnected system framework that might be helpful for helping to start some common language. Here's the installation guides. This is again what's posted with those chapters on the center's website. It is uh, my words, the cliff notes to chapter 4 and 5, and gives you the steps for installation with activities. There's also hyperlinks on some of those installation activities to additional resources. This is the school installation guide, but again, there's those hyperlinks and some guiding questions. So these are helpful if you're in a place of how do we start to install. At a school level, there's also a manual that helps with for a fidelity tool called the ISF Implementation Inventory that would help us assess where we're at within an integrated system. So some of you that said we are at more of that integrated approach, this might be a tool that might be useful in assessing where you're at and continuing to action plan and define out some next steps to enhance where your implementation might be. I believe most of those are also in the resource in your resources tab on the vertical toolbar there. And there's my email if there's other questions that you want to reach out with.
Thank you, Katie, for that insightful presentation. We really appreciate your time and expertise. We are at time and we will have a 30-minute break. Feel free to check out some booths, listen to a lightning talk, and we'll be back in at the 30 minutes for our keynote speaker, Vanessa Williams. Thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you, Monica.